So now we're going to look at some of the tissues that we've talked about in the previous videos. Remember, we looked at epithelials and connectives and muscles and nervous tissues. So let's look at some images and talk a little bit more about the characteristics of those types of tissues, as well as where they're found in the body and some basics on their function. So we'll begin with simple squamous epithelial. Now remember, when we talked about classification, we talked about the number of layers. Simple, one layer; stratified, more than one layer. And we talked about cell shapes, such as squamous being flat and columnar being, well, shaped like a column. Cuboidal, shaped like a cube or a box. So simple squamous epithelial, the definition or the term itself tells you that there's one layer of flat cells. They usually have just a little bit of cytoplasm. The cells are very tightly packed together, and when you look at them from the surface, they may, look at their apical surface, the top, they may look like a sheet of fried eggs. So if you think about this being a fried egg, there would be the yolk, and of course that would be the white of the egg. And what we really know is that is the nucleus, surrounding it is the cytoplasm, and there very clearly you can see the cell membrane. So epithelial tissues made up of simple squamous cells is usually found where filtration or the exchange of substances by rapid diffusion is a priority, such as in the kidneys where it forms part of the filtration membrane, or in the lungs where simple squamous epithelial cells are going to be making up the air sacs where we have to exchange oxygen and CO2 very easily. Of course, you're not going to find these types of tissues, simple squamous epithelials, making up areas of the body where there's a lot of wear and tear. So very, very thin, filtration and diffusion. Simple cuboidal cells, remember cuboidal are somewhat cube or box shaped. So simple tells you one layer, cuboidal tells you the shape. So these appear somewhat square in their appearance. However, they're not going to be completely square because that would create something that wouldn't create a good covering or a good lining. So a lot of times you'll see that these simply look like a bunch of little squares with great big obvious nuclei in the middle, and then you see them all forming a structure sort of like a tube which has an opening in the middle. And that's typically what you do see with those. So you find simple cuboidal cells covering the ovary and also lining some of our glands. So the main function of simple cuboidal is going to be for secretion of products from cells or from tissues onto or into an area, or to be able to absorb something across the walls of the structure. So here in this image of the tissues, you can see these are tubes that go through the kidneys, and of course the kidneys are going to filter the blood and get rid of waste products. So this is one of the more common places that you will see simple cuboidal cells. Non-ciliated, simple columnar epithelial. Well, that sounds like a mouthful, huh? But let's break down what that says. Simple, one layer. Columnar, tall and slender. Non-ciliated simply means that they don't have little hair-like projections. Okay, cilia are sort of like tiny, tiny, tiny little hair-like projections that extend off the cells and move things along. So this is non-ciliated. So instead of cilia coming off the top of the cells, you have these little structures known as microvilli. So microvilli are like finger-like cytoplasmic projections. So it increases the surface area of whatever area whatever tissues are made up of these types of cells. So let's look again. Columnar, long and skinny, epithelial, free surface, basement membrane, and attached to the connective tissues. So you have a lot of non-ciliated simple columnar epithelial cells lining the gastrointestinal tract from the stomach to the anus. Also, these are going to line a lot of the glands and the gallbladder. So embedded in these columnar epithelial tissues, you also have those goblet cells. Remember, goblet cells are unicellular glands that secrete mucus out onto a surface. So lining the digestive tract, lots and lots of columnar cells, and lots of goblet cells. So again, secretion and absorption. You find these in the digestive and respiratory tracts and the urinary and reproductive tracts. Also in the stomach, lots and lots of simple columnar epithelial cells, and lots of the mucus cells, especially in the stomach, helps to provide a protective covering over that tissue of the stomach so that it's not damaged by the hydrochloric acids that are in the stomach. Ciliated columnar epithelial, remember we're still looking at columnar, so long slender cells. We still have some goblet cells in there, but instead of having those little cytoplasmic extensions on the apical surface, instead there are little hair-like structures called cilia. Cilia is going to beat back and forth in a fluid-filled area. Remember, your body is filled with fluids, and as they do so, they're going to propel whatever is on top of that tissue through sort of a tube-like structure. So the cilia all beat in unison, and they move mucus and foreign particles through the respiratory tract back up to the throat so that we can cough it or spit it or get rid of it. I mean, think about when you're breathing in dust and dead skin cells and all types of things that we don't want getting down into the lungs. So those particles get trapped in the mucus in the respiratory tract, but we don't want it to stay in the respiratory tract, so the cilia beats and beats and beats, and as it does so, that mucus and all of the debris that's trapped in it moves up through the respiratory tract and into the throat so we can swallow in saliva and we never know it was there, or if it's something larger, we can cough or spit it out. This also helps us when we swallow something and it goes down the quote-unquote wrong tube or wrong pipe, right? So that cilia and the coughing action helps us to get rid of whatever it was. Cilia are also found in the fallopian tubes, or ciliated columnar epithelial cells are found in the fallopian tubes because it's the ovaries that are going to create the egg cells and ovulate them, and then those eggs get taken up into the uterine or fallopian tubes, and if fertilization is going to occur, it's going to happen in those tubes, and then it has to embed in the uterus. So the fallopian tubes are lined with ciliated columnar epithelial cells so that those oocytes can be moved from the ovaries through the uterine tubes and into the uterus. And again, if fertilization occurs, embed or implantation in the uterus, but if it doesn't occur, if fertilization doesn't happen, then that oocyte is expelled as we shed the inner lining of the uterus each month. More of that coming in the reproductive system. Pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial. Pseudo means false. So falsely stratified, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you it's not really stratified, but it sort of looks like it. So when you look at the pseudo-stratified from the side, you can see that nuclei are scattered everywhere, and it sort of looks like there may be more than one layer of these cells, but really all of these cells are attached to the basement membrane. So you can think of these as cells of many different heights, and the shorter cells, of course, don't extend all the way to the apical surface, but also because these cells are packed in so tightly, then some of these cells don't make it all the way to the top. So they're sort of being squished down, but all of them are originating from that basement membrane. So they all are attached. So you also find a lot of these cells in the respiratory tract to help get rid of those things that get trapped. So very much like we saw with the ciliated stratified columnar epithelial, these are ciliated pseudo-stratified columnar. It's just their appearance is a little bit different. All right, so we looked at simple layers of epithelial. Remember, simple was simply one layer. So now we're going to move into looking at stratified epithelial tissues. Again, just to remind you, stratified means more than one layer. So stratified squamous epithelial. What does that tell you? More than one layer of flat epithelial cells. So you see this in several different places in the human body. So let's look first at what's going on here. So all of this is made up of epithelial cells. Here's your basement membrane, and there's your connective tissues below. So you can see that the lower layers of the cells tend to look somewhat cuboidal, okay? And then as you go up, the cells are getting flatter and flatter and flatter and flatter, when up here in the most superficial layers, you can see they are very flat in their appearance. There's several reasons for that we'll look at as we continue to study tissues, especially as we're looking at the skin. But for right now, just realize that, of course, the closer to the surface these tissues get, or these cells get, the farther away they are from that vascular supply down here in the connective tissue. So these cells are receiving less and less nutrients, less and less oxygen, less and less of what they need to do their function and to remain as healthy, viable cells. So the cells tend to die as they get pushed farther and farther away from the surface. All right, so you find these types of tissues in the skin, also lining some of the wet surfaces such as the mouth, the esophagus, part of the pharynx and the vagina, and covering the tongue. So the function is to protect against abrasion, to keep water in the body, protect against ultraviolet radiation when you think about one of the functions of the skin, and to prevent foreign invasion or keep things out that shouldn't get in. So here you can see a layer of the wall of the vagina with layers and layers and layers of epithelial cells. And then you see the same thing with the skin. So all of this, beginning at the darker purple layer here, layers and layers and layers of epithelial cells, and down here we have the connective tissue. So the difference in the appearance of these two tissues that you just saw, both of them are composed of stratified squamous epithelial, but there's a protein called keratin. Keratin is found mostly in the outer part of the skin, where it's really going to sort of help provide a waterproof area. And again, we'll see more of that as we go through. I just wanted to give you an example of both of these. So stratified squamous, many layers of flattened cells. Transitional epithelium, to transition means to change. So this is epithelial tissue that has a very different appearance based on its location and also how much it's being pushed on. So think about what your urinary bladder does. Your urinary bladder stores urine, and it stretches as the contents get greater and greater. So the more and more urine in there, the more those tissues that make up the bladder are being stretched. So the transitional epithelium that makes up a part of the wall of the urinary bladder is able to change its shape. So if you look out here, you see, or in here, you see these are all transitional epithelial cells, and they look different than these transitional epithelial cells. So when they're relaxed, they're not being pushed against and stretched. They're more in that more rounded shape, I guess you would say. And then as you get deeper and deeper into the transitional epithelial cells, they appear to be more squishy. So again, transition you find in the urinary bladder and parts of the tubes such as the ureters and the urethra that are associated with the urinary system. And transitional meaning that they can change their appearance as they become stretched and flatter. Endocrine glands are made up of epithelial tissues that are going to be responsible for secreting something. So if you remember, we talked briefly about this. An endocrine gland secretes hormones into the interstitial fluid, or the area surrounding the cells, and then that hormone is going to diffuse into the bloodstream. Another thing to remember, your endocrine glands do not have a duct, so they don't secrete into that tubular structure. They secrete into the tissues, and then it's absorbed into the blood. So here we have an image of a thyroid gland, and if you look histologically at that, you have these somewhat cuboidal epithelial cells, remember? They're sort of square in shape, and those big round nuclei. So these are going to create structures known as follicles in the thyroid gland. And then inside that thyroid, we store stuff that we need to make the thyroid hormones. So you see these in lots of the endocrine glands, these types of tissues, endocrine tissues, glandular epithelial tissues in the glands, such as the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland. the adrenal glands and the pancreas, the ovaries and the testes, and the thymus. Many of these you'll see as we move into the endocrine system in later discussions. So what's the function of glandular epithelium? To create, release, and secrete those hormones. And hormones are chemical messengers that are going to regulate metabolic and physiological processes, all to maintain homeostasis of the body. Exocrine glandular epithelium creates secretory products that are released into ducts. Remember, ducts are just tubular structures that are used to take the product from a gland and secrete it out onto a surface, such as onto the surface of the skin or into the lumen or opening of a hollow organ. Your sweat glands and your oil or sebaceous glands, your ceruminous glands, which are the earwax glands, all of those are going to secrete onto the skin. Digestive glands, such as your salivary glands and your pancreas, are going to secrete into a lumen. They're going to secrete into the mouth, digestive into the mouth, and the pancreas into the lumen of the small intestine. So here you can see some glandular epithelium, and in this case we're looking at a sweat gland, so it's going to secrete that product into the lumen of the sweat gland, and then that's going to all feed into a duct that will empty out onto the surface. So what's the function of the exocrine glandular epithelium? To produce substances such as sweat and oil, saliva, and digestive enzymes that are secreted into a duct and onto a body surface or into a hollow organ. Embryonic connective tissue is a class of connective tissue that we sometimes call mesenchyme. So mesenchyme has cells called mesenchymal cells that are somewhat irregular shaped, and the ground matrix contains a lot of reticular tissues. So where is it found? In the embryo, along those developing bones and under the skin, but we also have some in quote-unquote adult connective tissue, especially along the blood vessels. And its function, mesenchyme, remember, just think embryonic primarily, and remember that it is used to form all other types of connective tissues. Continuing now with connective tissues and different types of connective tissues, areolar connective tissue is a very widely distributed connective tissue. So it has lots of fibers, such as the collagen, elastic, and reticular that we looked at, arranged very randomly, many different types of cells. So you see the macrophages and the fibroblasts and the fat cells and the white blood cells embedded in a semi-solid ground matrix, which means it's not hard, but it's not completely liquid either. So where do you find it? Everywhere. So in and around almost all body structures. So sometimes we just call this areolar connective tissue the packaging material of the human body. It's found in the subcutaneous layer of the skin. Remember, that was the fatty layer that's below the dermis. We find it in the reticular layer of the dermis. We find it in mucous membranes around blood vessels and nerves and body organs. So yeah, you get the picture. We have areolar connective tissue everywhere. So when you look at this in the lab, what I'll tell you is look for characteristics that are only found in your areolar connective tissue, and you don't find it in many of the others. So what's the function? Strength, elasticity, and support. Basically to give a framework and support all of the body tissues. Adipose tissue is what we commonly call fat tissue. So it's made up of cells called adipocytes that are specialized for storing fats. So think of this as a big old fat droplet of oil. So the cells fill up with that oil droplet. All the cytoplasm in the nucleus are squished out around the edges or the surface of that tissue. And when you look at it histologically, look at it with a microscope, you can see it just looks like a whole bunch of bubbly tissue. Okay, so you look for bubbles. So where do you find adipose tissue? Again, many places throughout the body, underneath the skin, around the organs, making up yellow bone marrow, padding in your joints, and behind the eye sockets. The function of adipose tissue is to provide insulation. It helps us to not lose heat, but it also can be used as an energy storage. So we can take those fat molecules, those lipids, and break them down and use them to make ATP. They protect and support other organs in the body, help us to maintain body temperature, and help us to rejuvenate or to make new body tissues. So what do you look for with fats or with adipose tissue? Look for lots and lots of bubbles and know their basic function. Reticular connective tissue. Remember, when you're thinking reticular, think network or mesh. So you've got a lot of very fine interwoven lacing together network of reticular fibers, and they form sort of a mesh network. You find a lot of these in areas where you do filtration or filtering something from the blood or through structures in an organ, such as the liver, the spleen, and the lymph nodes. You have lots of reticular tissue in your red bone marrow, helping to make up basement membranes and around blood vessels and muscles. So the function, of course, is to form a part of those organs, to bind cells together. But the main thing to remember with reticular, you have lots and lots of filtration. So creating that mesh network creates a lot of obstacles, I guess you could think of, within a tissue. So it allows filtration and removal of things such as old worn-out blood vessels in the spleen and your lymphatic system, your lymph nodes acting sort of like a coffee filter and removing bacteria and worn out cellular debris as that fluid moves and tries to get back into body circulation, back into the blood. So reticular, think network, and think filtration. All right, so continuing with connective tissues, dense, regular connective tissue. Dense means very tightly packed together, and regular refers to the arrangement. So you see here in the photomicrograph and here in the cartoon drawing, all of the fibers of these connective tissues, so these collagen fibers, are basically running in the same direction. So you find a lot of this dense, regular connective tissue forming tendons that attach muscles to bones, ligaments that attach bone to bones, and big sheets of connective tissue called aponeurosis, such as the one you have over your stomach and over your cranium, connecting muscles to bone or muscle to other tissue. So what's the function of all of this? Now think about this again. All of your fibers are running sort of in parallel rows. So this provides a very strong attachment, so it can withstand a lot of pulling force along the long axis of that fiber. So if you're pulling against these long tissues, this arrangement of these collagen fibers being parallel allows that tissue to resist tearing. Of course, we do know that tendons and ligaments get torn, and that tends to happen when there is excessive force on those tissues. Dense, irregular, the fibers are not running in the same orientation. So let's go back and look at this again. Regular connective tissue, long parallel fibers. Irregular connective tissue, man, those fibers are running in every direction. Okay, so made up still of collagen fibers, but fibers running irregular in their orientation, so in many different directions. So quite often you find this type of tissue in sheets, such as the fascia, which is beneath the skin and around organs or around muscles and other organs. You find dense irregular connective tissue in the dermis of the skin, helping to make up the fibrous pericardium of the heart that anchors the heart to the structures found around it, surrounding the bones in the periosteum and perichondrium that surrounds the cartilage. You find it in joint capsules and membrane capsules and within organs such as the kidney and the lymph nodes and the liver, and also helping to make up the heart valves. So with these fibers running in many different directions, it resists the pulling, or resists that those tissues being torn as that as the tissue made up of. All right, so let's try this again. It resists pulling and tearing when you have these tissues moving in many different directions. So think about the pulling of the the skin. When your body moves, it pulls in many different directions. We don't always pull in a long, straight line as most of our muscles do. So by having these connective tissues, these collagen fibers running in many different directions, then the organs that are made up of this dense, irregular connective tissue can withstand that pulling force from many different directions. All right, sorry about that. Sometimes the tongue just gets all tangled up and the brain's working faster than the mouth. Okay, hyaline cartilage. So we're still looking at connective tissues, and we'll look at some of the different types of cartilage. So hyaline refers to a glassy looking structure. So hyaline cartilage often appears as glass with cells embedded within. So a lot of times it's very shiny in its appearance. The collagen fibers are not very visible. So you can see here this sort of purple area here would be the hyaline cartilage matrix. Here you can see in the drawing, it's the pink. Okay, within that you have little structures known as lacunae that your cells are located within. So the lacunae or lacuna are sort of the place where the cells are located. So you can see there's sort of a little roundish looking structure, and within that you have a cell. So the cells are chondrocytes. Chondra refers to cartilage, cyte is cell. So you have very prominent chondrocytes found within the lacuna that are surrounded by that cartilaginous matrix. So to distinguish hyaline cartilage, you look for that glassy looking matrix. Again, the fibers that are found within are very, very, very small, very fine collagen fibers that are usually not visible. So this is the most abundant cartilage in the body. It's found at the end of our long bones, also on the anterior or the front part of the ribs where they attach to the sternum. We find this in parts of the larynx and the trachea, our respiratory passages, and also it makes up the embryonic and fetal skeleton. During development, our bones are not hard bones. They are simply a hyaline cartilage template that then has to become bone in a process we call ossification. So what's the function? By being this smooth, glassy structure, it provides a smooth surface for articulations where bone meets bone, so that you have a smooth surface. It also provides flexibility and support, but because the fibers are so small and so thin, it is a very weak type of cartilage that can easily be fractured. Fibrocartilage has chondrocytes. Remember, all cartilage is made up of cartilage cells, so chondrocytes found in little cavities called lacuna. So here you have 3 chondrocytes all in lacuna. Now, what you do see in fibrocartilage is very, very thick bundles of collagen fibers. So you can see very easily fibers running everywhere in every direction. So your fibrocartilage makes up your intervertebral disc. If you hear someone has a bulging disc between their vertebrae, that's made up of fibrocartilage. And also the pubic symphysis, where your hip bones come together and you can feel that pubic bone just above your genitalia. So that's actually where 2 bones come together, 2 bones that we'll learn later when we're studying the hip bones. So they join together very much like this, but rather than having vertebrae, fibrocartilage, you'd have pubic bone with fibrocartilage. So the function of the fibrocartilage is to support and to join structures together and make it very, very, very strong and rigid, because this is our strongest type of cartilage. The third type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. So you would expect elastic cartilage to have a very rich network of elastic fibers in the extracellular matrix. So this is going to provide a lot of strength and elasticity and help structures to be able to maintain their shape. So elastic cartilage you find on the top of the larynx. The larynx is what we commonly call the voice box, and it leads down into the trachea. So there's a little very elastic structure there called the epiglottis that closes when we're swallowing food or saliva or beverages, and it prevents those things from getting down into the trachea because we don't want it going into the respiratory passages, right? So that epiglottis is a little flap-like structure, very elastic in that it flops down and then it comes back. Elastic cartilage also makes up the external part of the ear called the pinna or the auricle. If you think about that, it's very elastic. You can move it around and it goes right back into shape. And also you find elastic cartilage making up the auditory or eustachian tubes that collect or connect the ear canal with some of the internal structures that we'll see that drain into the back of your throat. So what's the function of elastic cartilage? Provide strength and elasticity and to help maintain structures. So let's look at this elastic cartilage. You still have chondrocytes within structures known as lacuna. So chondrocytes within lacuna. So what do you look for with this? You look for lots and lots and lots of cells, lots of chondrocytes within the lacuna, and you look for those thinner little fibers that you can see that are your elastic fibers. Again, when you look at each one of these in lab, their structure will be very different, and I encourage you to find something about each one that gives it its distinct appearance so that you can identify those.